The air in the private boardroom of the Seoul Grand Hotel was thick with the scent of expensive tobacco and the stifling weight of a death sentence. Kang Ji-hoon sat at the head of the polished obsidian table, his face a mask of chiseled granite. Opposite him, a rival lieutenant from the Busan syndicate was sweating through a hand-tailored suit, stammering an explanation for a missing shipment of microchips. Ji-hoon didn't interrupt. He didn't have to. His silence was a physical pressure, a reminder that in this world, he was the dragon, a man whose mercy was as rare as his mistakes. I don't care about the storm in the East Sea, Ji-hoon finally said, his voice a low, melodic growl that made the room turn cold. I care about loyalty. And loyalty doesn't sink in the rain. He leaned forward, the shadow of his broad shoulders looming over the table, when the sharp, rhythmic vibration of his phone shattered the tension. Ji-hoon frowned. Only 3 people had this number, and none of them were permitted to call during a negotiation. He saw the name on the screen, Loretta. His first instinct was irritation, but as he pressed the phone to his ear, the irritation evaporated, replaced by a sudden, jagged spike of alarm. Sir. Loretta's voice was a ragged whisper, a sharp contrast to the calm, southern drawl she usually carried through the halls of his mansion. She wasn't just nervous, she sounded like she was hiding in a closet, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. Loretta, I am in the middle of a summit, Ji-hoon said, his eyes flicking to his bodyguards, who instantly tensed. Please, you have to come fast, she choked out. The madam, she's lost her mind, sir. She says Min Seo needs a lesson. She's going to punish her, and I can't. I can't stop her this time. She'll break her, Ji-hoon. She'll destroy everything your wife left behind. The mention of his late wife hit Ji-hoon like a physical blow to the chest. He looked at the men around the table, the killers, the thieves, the power brokers who feared him, and suddenly, they looked like children playing in the dirt. This was his world, his empire, but Loretta's trembling voice was a bridge to the only world that actually mattered. The world where a 6-year-old girl in a bright yellow dress was currently at the mercy of a woman he had invited into his home. Without a word of explanation to the Busan syndicate, Ji-hoon stood up. He didn't look back at the millions of dollars left on the table. The meeting is over, he snapped to his lead enforcer. Get the car. If we aren't at the estate in 10 minutes, start looking for a new job. As he strode out of the boardroom, the dragon's cold facade remained, but underneath, the father was screaming. Park Soo-jin did not enter Ji-hoon's life with a roar, she arrived like a soft, rhythmic rain that gradually flooded his world until he was drowning in her presence. 2 years ago, the Moretti-style mourning for his first wife, Min-ah, had turned the grand estate into a mausoleum. Ji-hoon had been a ghost wandering his own halls, his grief so profound that he could barely look at his daughter, Min Seo, without seeing the eyes of the woman he had lost. Soo-jin had appeared at a charity gala, a vision of porcelain skin and impeccable manners. She was the daughter of a high-ranking judicial official, a strategic alliance wrapped in the allure of a refined woman. She didn't push, she curated. She spoke of legacy, of the burden of the crown, and most importantly, of the need for a mother's touch to heal a broken child. To a man exhausted by the blood and steel of the syndicate, she felt like a sanctuary. Within 6 months, she had moved into the mansion. She replaced the old, vibrant photographs of Min-ah with abstract art and monochrome portraits that suited her aesthetic. She was a hurricane in silk, quiet but transformative, dismantling the warmth of the home under the guise of modernizing the family's image. Ji-hoon, distracted by a brutal turf war with the Busan factions, took her efficiency for care. He wanted to believe that the silence in the house was peace, not the suffocating stillness of a child being erased. Loretta, however, saw the edges of the hurricane. She watched as Soo-jin's motherly advice turned into sharp, biting criticisms of Min Seo's posture, her voice, and her spirit. Soo-jin was a master of the psychological scalpel, cutting away at the girl's confidence when Ji-hoon wasn't looking. You are a Kong, Soo-jin would whisper, her hand gripping the child's shoulder just a bit too tight. And a Kong does not cry. A Kong does not play with cheap dolls. You are a reflection of my status now, and I will not have you tarnishing it. By the time the wedding bells rang, the saint who had birthed Minnesio was a fading memory, and the hurricane had made herself the center of the household. Soo-jin had convinced Ji-hoon that Loretta was merely overly emotional and that Minnesio's growing withdrawal was just a phase of growing up. Ji-hoon, desperate for a partner who could manage the domestic front while he held the underworld together, chose to see the silk and ignore the wind. He didn't realize that a hurricane doesn't just change the landscape, it levels everything in its path until only the strongest remain standing. Loretta Hayes had lived long enough to know that in a house built on secrets, the truth was the only currency that could buy your life. From the moment Park Soo-jin moved into the estate, Loretta's instincts, honed by decades of navigating the silent codes of domestic service, had hummed with a low-frequency dread. She saw the way the new madam looked at Minnesio when the boss's back was turned. It wasn't the look of a mother, but that of a jeweler evaluating a flaw in a diamond she intended to crush. Loretta's burden began with a small, leather-bound ledger hidden beneath the loose floorboard in the pantry. At first, the entries were mundane. Monday, the madam threw away the girl's drawing of her mother. Tuesday, she made the child sit in the dark for 2 hours because she stepped too loudly. But as the weeks turned into months, the ink seemed to bleed with the weight of what Loretta was witnessing. She became a silent shadow, a ghost in a blue uniform, capturing the fragments of a soul being systematically dismantled. She knew she couldn't just go to Ji-hoon with whispers. In his world, accusations without proof were a death sentence for the accuser. So, Loretta began to record more than just words. Using the modest wages she'd saved, she purchased tiny, voice-activated recorders, tucking them into the silk linings of the parlor curtains and behind the heavy mahogany bookshelves. Every night, while the mansion slept in its gilded silence, Loretta would sit in her small room, her hands trembling as she listened to the playbacks. She heard Soo-jin's voice, usually so melodic and sweet, transform into a cold, venomous hiss. She heard the sound of Minnesio's muffled sobs and the chilling lessons in obedience that involved missed meals and destroyed toys. Each recording was a jagged piece of glass she was forced to swallow, keeping the pain inside so she wouldn't alert the predator in the master bedroom. The burden was a physical weight that stooped Loretta's shoulders. She saw Minnesio's vibrant yellow dresses beginning to hang loose on her thinning frame. She saw the light dying in the child's eyes, replaced by a haunting, hypervigilant confusion. Loretta felt like a conspirator in the abuse, her silence the price of her presence. But she knew she only had one shot. If she spoke too soon, Soo-jin would charm her way out of it and Loretta would be gone, leaving Minnesio completely alone. She waited, her ledger filling and her tape spinning, praying for the moment the hurricane would finally overstep, the moment the dragon would have no choice but to see. Minnesio had once been a child of sunlight and noise, her laughter a constant melody that echoed against the high, vaulted ceilings of the Kong estate. But under Soo-jin's reign, the mansion had become a cathedral of silence. The vibrant yellow dresses her father bought her remained in the closet, replaced by muted grays and stiff navy wools that Soo-jin deemed appropriate for a girl of her station. To Minnesio, the clothes felt like a suit of armor she was too small to carry. She spent most of her afternoons in the quiet room, a sun-drenched library that had become her gilded cage. Soo-jin insisted on hours of silent study and posture practice, claiming that a daughter of the Kong syndicate must embody perfection. If Minnesio fidgeted, she was denied dinner. If she hummed a song her mother had once taught her, Soo-jin would confiscate her favorite stuffed rabbit, the last gift Minna had given her, and lock it in a glass case she couldn't reach. Minnesio began to shrink, not just in spirit but in presence. She learned to walk without making a sound, her small feet gliding over the polished wooden floors like a ghost. She stopped asking for her father. She had seen how Soo-jin smiled at him, a mask of perfect devotion that made Minnesio feel like a liar for even thinking something was wrong. Whenever Ji-hoon walked into a room, Soo-jin would gently stroke Minnesio's hair, her fingers digging just deep enough into the scalp to serve as a warning, one word, and you will never see that rabbit again. The child's confusion was the most heartbreaking part of her isolation. She remembered a father who used to lift her high into the air, whose rough hands felt like safety. Now, he was a distant figure in a black suit, always surrounded by men with hard eyes and cold guns. She watched him from the shadows of the staircase, a tiny silhouette in a house that was no longer a home. She started to believe that her mother had taken all the love in the world with her when she died, leaving only a cold, silent vacuum behind. Loretta would sometimes catch Minacio's gaze across the dinner table. The girl's eyes, once bright with curiosity, were now hollow and hypervigilant, constantly darting towards Sujin to gauge the temperature of the room. There was no more singing in the garden, no more messy finger painting in the kitchen. Minacio had become a porcelain doll, beautiful to look at, perfectly still, and terrifyingly close to shattering. She was a child waiting for a storm to pass, unaware that the person supposed to be her umbrella was the one stoking the wind. The Tuesday afternoon air was heavy and still, the kind of silence that precedes a tectonic shift. In the center of the grand parlor, Minacio sat at the massive mahogany table, her small frame dwarfed by the opulence of the room. Before her sat a tall crystal glass of ice water, condensation beads rolling down the sides like slow, cold tears. Across the table, Sujin sat perfectly erect, the scratch of her fountain pen against parchment the only sound in the house. "Posture, Minacio," Sujin said, not looking up. "A lady of the Kong house does not slouch like a commoner." Minacio's back snapped straight, her muscles aching from hours of forced rigidity. Her hands, small and pale, reached for the glass. She was so thirsty, a calculated part of Sujin's discipline was to limit her water intake during study hours. But as her fingers brushed the cold crystal, a sudden, involuntary tremor seized her hand. Perhaps it was the exhaustion, or perhaps it was the sheer weight of the hypervigilance she lived under every second. The glass tipped. Time seemed to liquefy as the water surged across the dark, ancient wood. It hit the surface with a splash that sounded like a gunshot in the silent room, a transparent tide rushing towards Sujin's expensive silk sleeves and the handwritten letters that represented her social standing. Minacio froze, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice barely audible. The silence that followed was more terrifying than any scream. Sujin didn't move at first. She watched as a drop of water fell from the edge of the table onto her designer skirt. Then, slowly, she placed her pen down. When she looked up, the mask of the elegant socialite was gone. In its place was something jagged and feral. "You clumsy, worthless little brat," Sujin hissed, her voice trembling with a suppressed, toxic rage. She stood up, her chair screeching against the polished floor. "Do you have any idea what this table costs? What these letters are worth? You are just like your mother, weak, fragile, and utterly useless." She reached across the table, her hand snaking out to grip Minacio's chin, forcing the girl to look into eyes that held no mercy. "If you cannot act like a daughter of this house, I will treat you like the animal you are. Today, the lessons end. Today, we find out how much of you is left to break." From the shadows of the hallway, Loretta watched, her hand over her mouth to stifle a cry. She saw the predatory light in Sujin's eyes and knew that the punishment about to descend was unlike anything that had come before. She didn't hesitate. Retreating into the pantry, she pulled her phone from her pocket, her fingers shaking as she dialed the only man who could stop the hurricane before it leveled the last of his heart. The black Mercedes Maybach didn't just drive, it tore through the neon-lit streets of Seoul like a predator scented with blood. Behind the wheel, Ji-hoon's lead enforcer felt the car's frame shudder as they pushed past 140 kilometers per hour, weaving through the evening traffic with a precision that bordered on suicidal. In the back seat, Kong Ji-hoon sat in a silence so absolute it was more terrifying than the screech of the tires. His phone was still gripped in his hand, the screen dark, but Loretta's panicked whispers were echoing in his mind, over and over. "She's going to break her." He looked out the window at the blurred lights of the city he supposedly ruled. He was the man who decided who lived and died in the shadows of the docks, the man whose name made hardened criminals lower their voices. And yet, while he was playing God in boardrooms and back alleys, a snake had been coiling around his own heart. He thought of Minacio's mother, of the promise he'd made to her on her deathbed, "I will give her a life of peace." "Faster," Ji-hoon said. It wasn't a shout, it was a cold, jagged command that cut through the sound of the engine. Sir, there's a checkpoint ahead, the police. Drive through it, Ji-hoon interrupted, his eyes fixed on the horizon where the dark silhouette of the hills met the sky. If they follow us, let them. If they try to stop us, don't let them. The enforcer didn't hesitate. They blew past the flashing blue lights of a patrol car, the siren fading into the distance as they ascended the private road leading to the estate. Every second felt like a drop of acid hitting Ji-hoon's skin. He was counting the heartbeats, imagining Soo-jin's hand on his daughter, imagining the terror in Minaseo's eyes, the eyes that looked so much like the woman he had failed to save once before. As the iron gates of the mansion swung open, the car hadn't even come to a full stop before Ji-hoon was out of the door. He didn't wait for his guards. He didn't check his weapon. He moved with a lethal, singular focus, his black coat billowing behind him like the wings of a vengeful god. He reached the massive oak doors and threw them open with such violence that the hinges groaned. The house was too quiet. The air was thick with the scent of expensive lilies and the underlying, metallic tang of fear. He didn't head for his office. He didn't head for his bedroom. His instincts, sharpened by years of survival, pulled him toward the parlor. He could hear it now, the low, rhythmic vibration of a woman's voice, sharp as a blade, and the stifled, rhythmic hitch of a child trying not to cry. Ji-hoon reached the threshold of the room and stopped. His shadow stretched long across the polished floor, cutting through the light like a guillotine. The enforcer didn't hesitate. They blew past the flashing blue lights of a patrol car, the siren fading into the distance as they ascended the private road leading to the estate. Every second felt like a drop of acid hitting Ji-hoon's skin. He was counting the heartbeats, imagining Soo-jin's hand on his daughter, imagining the terror in Minaseo's eyes, the eyes that looked so much like the woman he had failed to save once before. As the iron gates of the mansion swung open, the car hadn't even come to a full stop before Ji-hoon was out of the door. He didn't wait for his guards. He didn't check his weapon. He moved with a lethal, singular focus, his black coat billowing behind him like the wings of a vengeful god. He reached the massive oak doors and threw them open with such violence that the hinges groaned. The house was too quiet. The air was thick with the scent of expensive lilies and the underlying, metallic tang of fear. He didn't head for his office. He didn't head for his bedroom. His instincts, sharpened by years of survival, pulled him toward the parlor. He could hear it now, the low, rhythmic vibration of a woman's voice, sharp as a blade, and the stifled, rhythmic hitch of a child trying not to cry. Ji-hoon reached the threshold of the room and stopped. His shadow stretched long across the polished floor, cutting through the light like a guillotine. The transformation was instantaneous. The snarling predator vanished, replaced by the porcelain socialite. Her face crumpled into a mask of photostress, her eyes welling with practiced tears. Ji-hoon. Oh, thank God you're home. I don't know what to do. Min-seo, she's had another episode. She threw the glass, she's been so defiant. I was only trying to calm her, to show her discipline. Ji-hoon didn't move. He didn't look at his wife. His eyes were locked on his daughter, who remained frozen on the floor, looking at him as if he were a ghost she wasn't sure she could trust. Loretta, Ji-hoon said, his voice a calm that was far more terrifying than a shout. The maid stepped out from the shadows of the hallway, her face tear-streaked but her posture resolute. She walked past Soo-jin without a glance and knelt beside Min-seo, shielding the girl with her own body. Is this the discipline you spoke of? Ji-hoon asked, finally turning his gaze to Soo-jin. She's lying, Ji-hoon. The maid is jealous, she's trying to turn you against me. Soo-jin reached out to touch his arm, her voice rising in a frantic, melodic pitch. I am doing this for us. For your legacy. You're never here, you don't see how difficult she is. I see everything now, Ji-hoon interrupted. He stepped into the light, and for the first time, Soo-jin saw the cold, predatory calculation in his eyes. It was the look he gave men before they disappeared. I see a woman who thought she could hunt in my house. I see a woman who mistook my silence for blindness. The silence that followed Ji-hoon's declaration was heavy, a suffocating pressure that seemed to squeeze the very air from Soo-jin's lungs. She stood paralyzed, her practiced tears drying instantly under the heat of his gaze. Ji-hoon didn't wait for her to craft another lie. He turned away from her entirely, as if she were nothing more than a ghost already purged from his life. He walked toward the center of the room, his heavy boots thudding softly on the rug. To anyone in the syndicate, this was the stride of a man about to deliver a death blow. But as he reached the small, trembling figure in the yellow dress, the dragon vanished. With a groan of leather and a sigh of heavy fabric, the most feared man in Seoul dropped to both knees. Min-seo flinched, her small shoulders hunching toward her ears, a habit of fear that had been carved into her over months of discipline. It was a movement that cut deeper into Ji-hoon's soul than any blade ever could. He stayed perfectly still, maintaining a respectful distance, his hands open and resting on his thighs. He made himself small, a mountain lowering itself to the valley floor. Min-seo, he whispered, his voice cracking with a vulnerability he hadn't felt since the day he buried her mother. Look at me, princess. Slowly, the girl lifted her head. Her eyes were wide, searching his face for the hardness she had grown to expect from the world. Instead, she found only a reflection of her own pain, mirrored in the eyes of a father who had finally woken up. I am so sorry, Ji-hoon said, his voice thick with a raw, honest grief. I was blind. I was busy building walls outside, and I didn't see the wolf I led into our garden. But that ends tonight. He reached out, his large, calloused hand hovering uncertainly before gently cupping her cheek. This time, she didn't flinch. She leaned into his palm, a small, broken sob finally escaping her throat. Is she going to stay? Min-seo whispered, her voice a fragile thread of hope. Never again, Ji-hoon promised, pulling her into his chest. He wrapped his coat around her, shielding her from the room, from Soo-jin, and from the cold silence of the past year. I am here now, princess. And I am never leaving your side again. You don't have to be quiet anymore. You can scream, you can run, you can fill this house with all the noise in the world. As Min-seo buried her face in his shoulder, her small hands clutching his lapels as if they were lifelines, Ji-hoon looked over her head at Soo-jin. The warmth in his eyes was gone, replaced by a glacial, murderous intent. He had found what he was fighting for, and God help anyone who stood in his way now. Soo-jin's face paled as she watched Ji-hoon cradle the child, but the shock quickly curdled back into a desperate, sharp-tongued defiance. You think a few tears change the truth, Ji-hoon? She is a difficult, broken child who needed a firm hand. You were never here. You have no proof of anything other than a mother trying to raise a daughter worthy of your name. Ji-hoon didn't even look up from Min-seo's hair. He reached into the inner pocket of his black overcoat and pulled out a sleek, obsidian-colored tablet. With a single swipe, he activated the screen. You're right about one thing, Soo-jin. I wasn't here. But my eyes were. A voice began to fill the room, distorted slightly, but unmistakably Soo-jin's. It wasn't the voice of the elegant wife or the grieving mother, it was the cold, venomous hiss of a predator. Eat the scraps from the floor, Min-seo. If you tell your father, I'll ensure you never see that doll again. You are a burden. You are the reason your mother is dead. The color drained from Soo-jin's lips. That's a fabrication. A maid's trick. I don't play tricks, Ji-hoon said, his voice dropping to a level that made the air in the room feel thin. He swiped again, and a video feed began to play, clear, high-definition footage from a camera hidden within the eyes of the very glass cabinet where she had locked Min-seo's toys. The screen showed Soo-jin towering over the trembling girl, her face twisted in a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred as she methodically tore the pages out of one of Min-a's old journals while Min-seo begged her to stop. I am a man of the syndicate, Soo-jin, Ji-hoon continued, finally standing up, though he kept one hand firmly on Min-seo's shoulder. I don't trust anyone implicitly. I planted these the day you suggested Loretta was unstable. I wanted to see who was truly lying. He stepped toward her, the tablet still playing the sounds of her cruelty. 6 months of recordings. 6 months of you dismantling my daughter's soul while you slept in my bed and spent my money. He threw a thick envelope onto the mahogany table, right into the puddle of spilled water. The prenuptial agreement has a clause regarding the endangerment of my heirs. It makes our marriage null and void. You are leaving this house with nothing but the clothes on your back. If I ever see your face and soul again, I will forget that I was once a husband and remember only that I am a judge. Sujin collapsed into a chair, the weight of the evidence crushing the last of her vanity. The hurricane had finally met the mountain, and for the first time in her life, she was the one who was truly silent. 6 months later, the morning sun poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Kong estate, no longer casting long, jagged shadows, but bathing the mahogany in a warm, golden glow. The oppressive silence that had once defined these halls was gone, replaced by a sound that made the guards at the gate exchange rare, knowing smiles, the clear, bell-like laughter of Minesio. She was back in her favorite bright yellow dress, spinning in circles on the plush rug as Loretta hummed a soulful melody from the kitchen. The mansion was no longer a mausoleum or a quiet room, it was a home. The abstract, cold art Sujin had installed had been stripped away, replaced by Minesio's messy finger paintings and framed photographs of a family that was finally whole. Jihoon stood in the doorway of the parlor, a cup of coffee in his hand. He was still the dragon to the outside world, his empire was as vast and formidable as ever, but his black suits no longer felt like armor. He had restructured his entire life, delegating the brutal mechanics of the syndicate to his lieutenants so he could be present for the moments that truly mattered. He had learned that a man could rule a city and still lose his soul if he failed to protect the heartbeat of his own home. Loretta emerged from the kitchen, carrying a tray of snacks. She caught Jihoon's eye and offered a small, respectful nod. There were no words needed between them. They shared a secret bond, forged in that terrifying 8-minute drive and the recordings that had saved a child's life. She was no longer just the help, she was the guardian of the hearth, the woman who had dared to wake the dragon when his house was on fire. "Papa, look!" Minesio cried, running to him and clutching his knees. She held up a new drawing, a picture of the three of them standing under a massive, smiling sun. Jihoon knelt, not with the heavy weight of a man seeking forgiveness, but with the easy grace of a father who knew he was loved. He lifted her high into the air, her yellow skirt fluttering like a butterfly's wings. For the first time in years, the memory of his first wife didn't bring a sharp pang of grief, but a soft sense of peace. He had kept his promise. As the sound of Minesio's singing filled the room, Jihoon realized that he hadn't just saved his daughter that night, she had saved him. He had traded an empire of fear for a kingdom of laughter, and as he held her close, he knew it was the only territory truly worth defending.